Well, greetings, colleagues, students. I have the great pleasure today to introduce my longtime colleague, Mary Boyce, who is the Skinner and McAlpin Professor of Practical Theology here at Union, and our former academic vice president and dean, a major service to the school. Having previously served as professor at Boston College for 17 years, she's authored 6 books, including Has God Only One Blessing?, Judaism as a Source of Christian Self-Understanding, and Redeeming Our Sacred Story, The Death of Jesus and Relations Between Jews and Christians. She's also editor or co-editor of 4 other books and has numerous articles in books and journals. And her latest book, Blessing of a New Dawn, Reorienting the Relations Between Christianity and Judaism, will be published in the fall of 2027. Mary Boyce is the recipient of honorary doctorates from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the Catholic Theological Union, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Gratz College, and Misericordia University. And she's the current chair of the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. A native of Seattle, she is a vowed member since 1968 of the Sisters of Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, a congregation of Roman Catholic women. We look forward to hearing about your work. Mary.
I'll just hand you my notes. Well, thank you all for coming. And first of all, I had a hard time deciding on a topic. There's lots of things I'm interested in. I eliminated from the beginning any mention of the Pharaoh and the sycophants and his army who are occupying Washington, D.C. I wanted to do something a little more hopeful in this season. And so, as you know, I decided on the topic of interreligious friendship, and particularly when interreligious friendship graces a life. So while I'll talk a little bit about how it's graced my life, I'm hoping that this is an experience that each of you has had, or if not, you haven't had it yet, that it will be something that comes as this wonderful surprise in your own life. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to do a terribly academic thing, but I want to do first sort of a sketch how this happened, because I didn't set out to do I didn't set out to be a professor, I didn't set out to be a theologian, or let alone to be graced by interreligious friendships. That's what I think grace means. It happens, and one responds. So first I want to just sketch things. I'm afraid it's going to be a little longer sketch. There's kind of more pages in the sketch because since I have been at Union, I seem to have gotten older. Well, I don't know. It's 31 years now, Serene, so I'm afraid I'm 31 years older than when I was 10 when I arrived here. So there was nothing in my growing up that predicted this. I'm very proud of being from Seattle, as if somehow I had something to do with it. It's just a wonderful place, so beautiful, so rainy. But it was then, and even more so now, a quite secular city. So while I grew up as a Catholic, a daughter of a Catholic mother, and I went to Catholic school for 17 years, I never had the sense that we were the only ones, whether as a Catholic or a Christian. In our neighborhood, which was a very much lower middle class neighborhood, people were various Protestant denominations, and I don't know that there were any, I don't think, I was trying to remember the old neighborhood, I don't recall anybody who was not from a Christian tradition or there were many people, as is the case in the Pacific Northwest, who were nuns, N-O-N-E-S. That is, people who don't affiliate with any religious tradition. So I didn't grow up in a Catholic ghetto. My father, who lived to be nearly 97, did not believe in God, I don't think. We never talked about it. So I knew as a child that even though and of course in those days, that the hostility was more between Catholics and Protestants. We didn't talk so much about the others, but so I just knew that only my kind didn't populate heaven. I just knew that sometimes, even in the first grade, I remember I loved my first grade teacher, but on this matter she was wrong. If somehow my father weren't included in the graciousness of God, then there was something wrong with God. And he's always my greatest supporter, and sort of strangely, wonderful. So, but the times in which I lived did shape me in a very profound way. So when I started high school in the 1960s, okay, I'm 77, skip with the arithmetic problems, okay? So it was the dawning of the ecumenical age, and there was this council going on for Catholics in Rome, the Second Vatican Council, which we celebrate the 60th anniversary this October of its final meeting in October 1965. So I was shaped by those sensibilities. And there were things happening. There was a synagogue a couple of miles away, and the rabbi from that synagogue and the priest, who was the pastor of my grandmother's parish, were friends, and they did a television talk show before these things were phenomena. And when the pastor built a new church, the rabbi's wife, who was an artist, designed the altar. Now, these things are so common today, but it wasn't common then. And there's a picture in my yearbook, which you will never see, of a group from that synagogue coming to our high school for a day of dialogue in the spring of 1965. So somehow that sensibility was all there. Oh, I forgot two things. Well, the main thing, really, is that we had in my extended family a very close friend. She came to every family birthday, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, 4th of July. She was Jewish. My grandfather had helped her to get into business, and she wasn't religiously Jewish. She had no other family in the Seattle area, so we were her family, and no one thought of trying to convert her. She was just like another aunt to me. Oh, but then there's another story going back further, and I think this has more to do with things than I realize. So one of my mother's older sisters told me this story. My mother was too young to remember, so she grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. You know, Minnesota, nice. And my grandmother had 4 children, and the woman next door, who was an Orthodox Jew, had 4 children. So they didn't need to do interreligious dialogue. They needed to share childcare and borrowing some more flour or whatever it is you do with your neighbors. But one of the stories my Aunt Dorothy told me is that when one of the Jewish kids got to a certain age where he was going to push back against his mother, he wanted to try some non-kosher foods, and they kept a kosher house. So she said to him, "You go next door to Mrs. Wagner, and she'll find a piece of ham for you." Which was, of course, brilliant parenting, it seems to me, not to make something so problematic. But it's also a testimony to what neighbors can be for one another. My grandmother never talked about those things, but the very fact that Pauline was such a great friend of our families, I think in some way goes back to simply being neighbors. Okay. All right, then in all back there. So I entered this community of very feisty women. Surprising I would enter such a community, is it not? And, the kind of, especially the interreligious vision was not so much present then, and I didn't really do too much, except I remember in college reading Abraham Heschel's The Prophets. And I reread that so many times, and that book has always stayed with me as one of the great classics. So, but it wasn't really till I moved to New York City in 1974. I want to know that you weren't born yet, that your parents weren't married yet. But anyway, so I came here to study, and also at Teachers College. And so this was the first chance I've sort of, living in New York City, one learns a little Yiddish, and learned something about the feel for Jewish culture and so forth. But it wasn't so much an intellectual interest, except it did surface in my dissertation. My interest was really in two things, as a synthesis: Bible, particularly New Testament, and education. My passion has been and remains, how do religious traditions pass on their tradition? And so while I work more specifically in Christianity, I'm fascinated to how every religious community does this. So then I wandered into Boston College. I hadn't finished my dissertation yet, and I never intended to stay on the East Coast. Don't ask me to help you with your 5-year plan. It wasn't in my personal strategic plan, I can tell you that. But at any rate, so I taught at Boston College, and there were certain things that happened there, some of my colleagues, so forth. But in 1981, so 3 years after my dissertation, I wrote an article that I have absolutely no memory what motivated me to write, called Questions That Touch on the Heart of Our Faith. It's a great title. It wasn't my own. It was actually from a document written by the Catholic bishops of France in 1973. I don't know. Anyway, I've reread the article. It was not so bad. But a couple years later, I got a phone call completely out of the blue from a rabbi at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, Michael Signer. Now, I'm like an untenured assistant professor, not exactly filled to the brim with confidence, and he's calling to ask me to be the main speaker at an event they had annually in LA at the theological schools in the area called InterSem. And why had he asked me? Because he had read my article. Okay. So I'm holding the phone out here, but we had phones connected to cords then, but we didn't dial. We'd moved a little beyond that. And I remember thinking, this is crazy, going all the way. I'm not a keynote speaker for theological seminaries in Los Angeles. But he was so funny and so persuasive and so charming in a weird sense. So he said, look, don't say yes or no. My colleague Sarah Lee is coming to Boston for Passover, which was going to be in a couple months, and she'll sit down with you and tell you what we have in mind. So that came to pass, and Sarah and I met together. And ever since, well, as you heard, I write and think a lot about the relationship of Christianity and Judaism. Sarah and I wound up doing talks together. She hosted me when I went to LA. I lived with her on many occasions for various and sundry things. She's the greatest conversation partner you could ever imagine. Just so bright and wonderful. And she was the director of the School of Jewish Education. Sue knows her. And so we did all these things together. And then meanwhile, about 40 years ago, unlike my colleague Gary Dorian, I do not have a razor-sharp memory. So when I say about 40 years ago, it could be 39, it could be 41. But anyway, I was asked to join a group called the Christian Scholars on Jews and Judaism. So this was a group of us that just met together twice a year. We gave papers with and for one another. Excellent feedback, excellent conversation, and was such a gift professionally. It wasn't the kind of intellectual warfare that we sometimes see, the worst of academe. There were very, very fine critiques, but they were never given with cruelty or with a misuse of power. And I still belong to that group. Since COVID, it's been more difficult for us to meet and all that, but they're still some of my greatest friends. Okay, so I'm moving rapidly in history. So one of the involvements that I've been part of is various projects with involving Christian scholars, Catholic and Protestant, and sometimes Orthodox, and Jews in studying various issues. So my friend Michael Signer, the rabbi who got me into all of this many years ago, had moved from Hebrew Union College to, of all places, the University of Notre Dame, which is a very Catholic atmosphere. He called me one time shortly after he got there, and he says, I got like 6 Murphys in my class. I said, well, what did you expect, Michael? There's not very many Cohens, it's just how the way it goes. But anyway, so we stayed in touch all these years. He was a medievalist. And so in 2008, one of these projects that I was on, we were being hosted by Notre Dame and specifically by Michael. So I was really looking forward. I hadn't seen him for a couple of years. And when we got to campus, and you can't imagine how ebullient Michael was. Anyway, there was no ebullience that day. 2 days before, he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So that really colored all our discussions. He took part a little bit, but it wasn't the Michael we knew. And on the final day, we put our heads together and we said, we need to have a service of some kind. And we were very, very attentive to the sensibilities of interreligious worship, particularly Christian and Jewish. But we decided that this was something that the issue transcended whatever sensibilities we had. So Rabbi Ruth Langer, who is at Boston College, presided. It was really the service of blessing. And I don't remember anything much about the service. It was mostly psalms, and I think we had some music. And at the end, we each blessed Michael and his wife Betty, and they blessed us in turn. I really can't talk about it all these years later. But that's when something like interreligious engagement really hit. Because for all our differences, and they are many, mortality comes for us all. And the love that was witnessed that day. Okay, Michael died that was in August. He died that January. He was 63. That might seem old to some of you, but it's very young. So I give thanks for him, and my friend Sarah Lee, she's older than I. She's in her early 90s. And I just talked with her daughter this morning, and she's taken a deep dive toward death just now, just in the last few days. So it was wonderful that I could talk to her daughter and have, suggest something. So the book that I have coming out in the fall, I've dedicated it to 3 Jewish women, one of whom is Sarah. So I'm going to send her daughter the text of that dedication so she can read it to her mother before she goes. So I've been very fortunate in my friends. Now, intellectually, this is the second part. the sort of the insights. So the thing about Christianity and Judaism is that there's a history that's extremely painful. And to take so while there are many theological issues, it's the history that always one has to come back to, because it's a history of the imbalance of power and the history of theological and political and economic domination by Christianity. So it's extraordinarily painful to study. At the same time, if we don't look at this history and preferably together, we'll never overcome it. And I had an experience in a class here at Union a number of years ago that I think encapsulates what I'm trying to say. So we were doing the period of the Reformation. And one of the persons in the class was a Lutheran woman who was going to be ordained in the next, 4 or 5 months. Lovely woman. And we had read some of Luther. Now, Luther has a very vast library, but one of his later essays is on the Jews and their lies. And she, in all her formation as a Lutheran, had never known of this. Now remember, she's reading this in a class that's half students from JTS. And I think her response in class said more to the JTS students than any other thing that I was co-teaching with Shuli Reuben Schwartz from JTS. And I think that experience for them of realizing how painful it is for us to be honest with our own history healed some of the pain. So one of the things that Sarah and I really believed in is the power of learning in the presence of the other. And this is what really makes me so proud of Union. It's not the only thing. But the possibility of interreligious engagement here, which is not just learning about the other, but learning with the other, is for me so fundamental to any theological education in our time. And as we learn this, it may be that interreligious friendships develop. It may not be quite yet. It may be that you become sort of prepared for one. Because you can't really seek a friendship. You just have to be open to one. So I think I'm going to wind down. I'm sure there's more to say. Just going to 3 other things. One is my own gratitude at being part of the interreligious engagement field. I am not trained, as are my colleagues, in comparativist methodologies. I graduated before anybody really was doing much of that. I mean, I don't mean no one was doing it, but so the John Totana-Mills of the world were still to be discovered. But I learned from them. I'm sorry I said something nice about you. You know what? You too may be privileged to grow old. Yeah, I hope. So the notion that this is not just studying the other religion, but this is an engagement with the other is so important to our curriculum and to the other members of the faculty. We learn from one another. The second thing, I should never say 3 things because then I can't remember the second. This today, April 9th, is the 80th anniversary of the death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And one of the things that has been influential in Christian theology with Bonhoeffer is this notion of cheap grace. And it struck me that interreligious friendship is also not a cheap grace. It is costly. It's not well understood. It's not particularly valued. So now, Bonhoeffer was not so much interreligiously engaged in terms of friendship, but he was in terms of sensibilities, and particularly in terms of his notion of the absolute importance of honoring another's life. I thought of, so the last thing I'd like to end on is this phrase, this wonderful phrase, and I'm sure many of you have heard it in classes because it's frequently quoted. It's from the great Lutheran scholar Christer Stendahl, who was the dean at Harvard Divinity School when I lived in Boston, a Swede, later became the Bishop of Stockholm after he was dean at the Divinity School. I don't know whether Serene's ever going to become a bishop. I don't think that the UCC church has bishops, so maybe you should, think of another church where you could become one, except they wear these funny hats, so that's why I don't become a bishop. But he has this phrase, holy envy, which means something like to see and to savor and to value something you see in a religious other that draws you in, but you know it's not for you to take or to imitate. And I think that's really what IE at Union, and I hope actually for all of us, is that we're trying to teach and live, or maybe I should say live and therefore teach our own holy envy. So, I didn't even look at my watch, and I'm sure I have 2 minutes left.
There's plenty of time for some discussion.
Anyway, so I'm happy to take comments or questions. I'm deaf in my left ear, so use your voice.
We'll also have mics available, so.
You can make a comment.
The concept of the notion of holy envy is so beautiful. Is there a concept you might pair with it that captures that same sense of holiness, but that there are things that you can learn and incorporate? Like how you distinguish between that which is not yours to take and the things that actually do transform you and become part of you. What would a pairing look like?
So let me take as one example, because I've been so graced by sitting at many Shabbat tables, either Friday night or I think my favorite sort of Saturday lunch. Spend Saturday lunch just talking to one another instead of doing the laundry and cleaning and all of the things that Saturdays have. But more than that, for my friends who really are shaped by a 25-hour period every single week when they do not use their electronics, when they do not drive, when they do not spend money, that is so countercultural. Now, I'm my own rabbi, which is the worst part of this, because I know how to make exceptions. After all, I worked with the Jesuits for 17 years. I know how to rationalize anything. So, but the need in our lives for rest, for ceasing to work. So the best I can do maybe is Sunday. I do go to church. And I try not to work on Sundays. Geez, I live down the hall from the dean. You don't know how guilty I feel. No. So, but the importance of cease, because the real meaning of Shabbat is to cease from work. And I know about the Protestant work ethics, but we Catholics have a pretty good one too. So that's, to me, an example. I don't light Shabbat candles, but the other thing that goes with this is hospitality. Making something special, because the Shabbat meal is a festive meal. And, so the value of hospitality, which crosses all religious traditions. But the Jews are so wise, they've made it a real practice that is regular. Now, my dear friend Sarah, a Reformed Jew, worked harder than I do, and she didn't really observe Shabbat. So my Jewish friends were I also think it's because she was widowed very early, and as her kids left home, a Shabbat meal, unless you have company or you're invited somewhere. But when I went with Sarah, we would do Shabbat together. Okay, I'll try to be very, if there's one or two, I don't want to go too much over time. Tony.
It's a comment and a question at the same time. I think in interreligious friendships, there is something that is very unique that doesn't exist in interreligious conversations in intellectual places and academia. I think there is more room for feisty disagreements that can be less politically correct and more honest. This is how I experienced my interreligious friendships. So I am curious, how did you deal with differences in your friendships?
So you brought back a memory of being at a Seder in Boston with Sarah's family. So that's when her third child basically came out to the family with his friend. I mean, it was as obvious as the day is done. But, it's a very intellectual family. There's two doctors and a filmmaker. And they all have strong opinions, as does Sarah. They got on the topic of Israel. And I was the only non-Jew there. And they were back and forth about, and this is a long time ago, what Israel is. The problems with Israel-Palestine have not just started yesterday. And I realized I'd become part of the family, that they could, in essence, show their dirty laundry. I mean, they were really, they loved each other and they disagreed so sharply with each other. And then the rest of the meal went on and we, so I think that's one of the important things is that when we think of a religious other we don't know, we think of them as a homogeneous group. Well, Jews are certainly not homogeneous. I can say the 1.4 billion Catholics, God help us all, we are definitely not of one heart and one mind and one soul on all issues or on any issue, and so on and so on. So that the genius of knowing one person and then another in the tradition is to say, oh, there's this difference. And then when you see differences modeled among them, then it makes us more able to ask questions or to be asked questions. So one day Sarah and I, we had a colloquium together for 3 years. And one day we're sitting at her home in the San Fernando Valley and she says to me, so, what about the Trinity? Well, what about it, Sarah? And the phone rang. It was a professor from Claremont, and I always said to her later, Mary Elizabeth Moore, oh, thank God you called. Well, I did go home and read some more books about the Trinity, but so there you are. I think I should close. I think I may have gone over time unless there's somebody with a burning comment or question. All right, my child, Dr. Tanamanil.
So what have we who do this as a field yet to learn from what you've learned from doing it without the burdens of the theoretical categories of the field, something from perhaps interreligious friendship?
Well, my guess is that what you do, knowing you, is that when you're teaching about, say, Hinduism, you're teaching as an intellectual, a critical understanding of another religious tradition, but you're also conveying your respect and affection for Hindus whom you know and work with, your colleagues. And that conveys as much as the intellectual rigor. So how we, how we show our emotional connections to the other. Our personal and professional are always intertwined. So, okay. The president has left, so now we can really, now we can really be honest.
Thank you.